Those conditions required that Hank have absolutely no violent contact with Marlena. The presiding judge ordered Hank's bond to be set at $5,000 on January 17, 2017. Additional bond conditions after the second arrest included no contact of any kind, direct or indirect, and no alcohol or drug use. Hank's bond was posted by a bail bondsman the same day he was arrested. Also, that same day, a civil protection order was granted to Marlena. The order was granted ex parte, or without a formal hearing, which is considered an emergency of sorts. The need for the protective order is so great that it can be granted by a judge without the hearing, though the respondent, or person being served the order, has the opportunity to contest the protective order through a formal hearing at a later date. However, on January 26, 2017, only 9 days after initially requesting the ex parte order, Marlena returned to court to ask the judge to dismiss the order. It was granted immediately, and the protection order was dismissed. On March 6, 2017, Hank again violated his bond conditions when he committed another assault on Marlena. This time, police were dispatched to Connie Long's home at 317 Oakland Avenue in Utica, Ohio, which happens to be the neighbors of Hank's parents. Hank started one of his typical fights with Marlena, and she was able to run on foot to Connie's house seeking shelter. The reason Hank was angry was because Marlena made a decision, without his approval, to drive herself to the hospital. Earlier that day, the couple was at a hotel where they had gotten a room for the evening. While there, Hank did something to Marlena, which caused an injury to her neck. They left and were supposed to be going to the hospital, but Hank opted to drive to his parents' house instead. Frustrated and tired of the violence, Marlena made the choice she was going to take herself in for medical treatment, so when they got to his parents, she exited the passenger side and got in the driver's seat of her own vehicle and attempted to leave. Immediately, Hank began punching her, trying to pull her from the car while also kicking at her. He seized hold of her phone, throwing and breaking it, once again effectively preventing Marlena from seeking help. Thankfully, this time there were neighbors nearby. Help was nearby. Wasting not even a second, Marlena got up and ran to Connie's house. Hank managed to jump back into the running car and threw it into gear, trying to run Marlena over. Mercifully, he missed her, but did run over some bushes on Connie's property. Once she was ensconced in the safety of Connie's home, 911 was called. Marlena was bleeding from a cut on her head, and her upper lip was also cut and bleeding.
She ran for our door, and he drove in the yard. He, accelerated, almost ran her over. She was bleeding from her head and face, shaking terribly, difficulty breathing.
By the time police arrived, Hank was long gone. Another arrest warrant for domestic violence in the first degree and criminal damaging was issued on March 7, 2017. Criminal damaging is when you knowingly damage another person's property. The same day, another protection order was granted ex parte. 2 weeks later, on March 23, 2017, Marlena filed a letter with the court stating that she wanted to help Hank and had every intention of working with him to overcome his anger issues. She never wanted him in jail and felt he was struggling with a severe mental disorder and needed help and treatment for that. This is not uncommon in domestic violence relationships, and is one of the many reasons it is difficult for a victim to leave their abuser. They see the good qualities and want to help. Marlena was a caretaker and desperately wanted to see Hank be better, be the man she thought he could be. With her letter to the court, Marlena asked for the most recent protection order to be lifted, and a hearing to address the matter was set for April 7th, 2017. Before the court hearing, Hank had a pretrial conference at the Licking County Municipal Court, Immediately following, he was sentenced on his prior charges by Judge Michael Higgins. His sentence included 180 days in jail, but he only had to serve 90 days up front. The additional 90 days was to be held in abeyance, or on hold, and to be served at the court's discretion, or if the offender violates their probation terms. Hank was also sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation, which was to commence immediately following his 90-day jail sentence, and he was ordered to attend the Woodlands Batterers Group. Lastly, an intensive probation officer was appointed to interview Hank to determine whether he qualified for early release from jail. On April 7, 2017, the hearing was conducted regarding Marlena's personal protection order. Once again, the judge dismissed the order on the petitioner, Marlena's request. Worse, on April 12, 2017, at 9 a.m., Hank was released from jail after the Intensive Supervision Probation Officer, or ISP, recommended that Hank was a good fit for the early release program.
There was an incident where one of our staff was harmed by her partner, and he was temporarily incarcerated.
Was he just released?
In the past 30 to 45 days.
Were there problems since his release?
Not that we knew of. We thought things had settled down.
Until this morning?
Until this morning, yeah.
That's the thing with so many abusers. They are charming and incredibly manipulative, and it isn't unheard of for them to convince professionals in the criminal justice system that they are misunderstood or willing to change. A risk assessment was also conducted, also not uncommon, and Hank scored a 15, which is a moderate risk. Despite the moderate risk for violence and reoffending, the probation officer had the ability to override a score after considering mitigating factors, including past criminal history, violent tendencies, and the nature of the offense. There is yet another assessment that measures the offender's readiness to change. However, it appears that this assessment was never performed, though it very much should have been. Essentially, Hank was sentenced to standard probation terms, and no enforcement of the judge's orders were done. The batterers group was never completed, and no adverse action appears to have been taken either.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
On May 4th, 2017, Marlena made another complaint of domestic violence against Hank, alleging an incident from that morning, stating that Hank got angry and started choking her. He took her phone, thus preventing her from calling for any help, and worse, he wouldn't let her leave. The following day, on May 5th, she was granted another civil protection order. In the request for the order, Marlena stated that her previous request to drop the orders hinged solely on Hank promising her that he would seek intensive psychiatric treatment, yet he continued to fail, or refuse, to follow through. Marlena felt she could no longer support his issues, and the last sentence on her request for protection read, quote, "I am afraid to be alone with him, and that he will hurt me for good." The order was granted ex parte, or without hearing again. Hank was ordered to turn over his firearms, and he complied. Partly. He turned over one pistol and retained the rest. Marlena called the probation officer to notify Hank's supervising agent about the new protection order and domestic violence incident. The senior probation officer told the probation office to file a warrant if Hank didn't appear for his next check-in appointment. The senior probation officer told the probation office to file a warrant if Hank didn't appear for his next check-in appointment. On May 10th, the ISP officer tried calling Hank, but wasn't able to make contact. A letter was mailed to Hank, informing him that he had 5 days from the receipt of the letter to report to the office. He would never make that appointment. for only 2 days later, on May 12, 2017, he committed the repulsive shooting that culminated in the grisly murder of 3 innocent people. Surveillance footage later showed Hank at a Walmart in Heath, Ohio, purchasing ammunition, paying with a $100 bill. An investigation was also conducted on the probation department in order to determine why Hank was released from jail so quickly. Some of the findings included: the probation officer didn't get input from the victim regarding early release. The probation officer didn't read all 3 incident reports about the prior domestic violence incidents. And lastly, no additional terms of probation were imposed. There was not a no-contact order, and therefore, the victim bore the sole burden of obtaining their own protection orders, and it appeared the entire situation was blamed on the victim in this case. At the time of the shooting, Hank wasn't permitted to own or possess a firearm, which was a result from his 2010 conviction for abduction. It is believed that he purchased his guns from a variety of gun shows, which allowed him to avoid criminal background checks. On the day of the shooting, at approximately 2:40 p.m., the police entered Hank's house to execute a search for evidence and information. A total of 64 guns were located, along with massive amounts of ammunition, a laptop, and several $1,000s in cash. The 64 guns included 21 shotguns and 20 rifles, and the remainder were a mix of pistols and revolvers. A .45 caliber pistol was discovered in the first-floor hallway. It had an empty magazine. An empty gun case for a .45 caliber pistol was located in Hank's father's gun safe. People came out of the woodwork to describe their encounters with Hank. Connie, the neighbor Marlena ran to after one incident, claims that she never really had an issue with Hank before, but after the attack she rescued Marlena from, she was afraid of him. Connie described Hank as a ticking time bomb, and wasn't surprised when she heard about the shooting. After the shooting, Hank's dad was charged with 4 counts of forgery and 4 counts of tampering with records. He pled guilty to all counts and was sentenced to a year of probation and some fines and costs. The reason he was charged is because after the shooting, Hank's dad sold a 1984 Chevrolet truck for $1,600. Yet, he wasn't legally permitted to sell the truck because it had Hank's name on the title. Hank's dad wrote a letter stating that his name and the name on the title were the same, insisting that he went by the same name as his son. In fact, Hank's dad did this with 4 vehicles that were titled to Hank. His dad brought the original titles to a title office to get replacement ones, forging Hank's name and listing his dad as the new owner. The documents were notarized, but the notary later admitted to improperly notarizing documents. His dad had no criminal record, and his attorney claimed he was struggling to deal with his son's estate and got confused, which is likely why he served no jail time. After the shooting, many of the Pine Kirk Care Center employees left to work at Utica Care Center, which was under the same ownership as Pine Kirk. One such nurse eventually sought a civil stalking protection order against Hank's father, because on no less than 4 occasions she, along with other employees, witnessed him driving slowly by the center, using narrow alleyways and along the back side of the building. The police warned him about trespassing, but he claimed to be merely visiting a friend that lived near the center, and he used the alley to park his car. Police issued their warning, along with an admonishment to park elsewhere. Apparently, the care center employees weren't done being terrorized, because on October 22, 2017, the Utica Care Center was placed on lockdown after Hank's dad was seen parking his vehicle behind the building, and then just sitting there, watching. It was disturbing, and it was frightening. Employees were panicked. Police were called and provided photos that one nurse managed to snap while he stood outside, watching. After the lockdown was lifted, the Utica Care Center hired 24/7 security. It didn't take long before he was arrested for violating the order by being within 500 feet of the building. After pleading not guilty to the charge, Hank's father's attorney claimed that his client